All right, this is the Hangout for July 13th, 2016 for Introduction to Glaze Formulation Online from Alfred University. I am Matt Katz. So here we are deep into materials. We've officially hit what could be considered the middle of the term. The midterm is live now, and it's up for a couple of days, so don't freak out. I think it's up through Friday. Um, and we've now gotten through what I would call the hard parts only because they're boring. Not that there's anything conceptually hard about them. It's just getting through the list of materials. At this point, the tough thing is I would really hope for you to sort of become familiar with glaze materials by what they are and what their brand names are. And I think that that's a really important identifying factor, because it seems to me a lot of what happens is people go into the glaze lab and they just sort of don't know what they're looking at, and they don't really understand what's behind what they're working with. And so you get a glaze formula and it's this much of this and this much of that. Well, I find, and hopefully that you would believe the same, that you need to know what these things are. You need to know what kind of feldspar G200 is versus what kind of feldspar Minspar is, and what really is going on in an ethylene cyanide, because I think that there is a lot of misinformation that gets passed around, specifically when talking about something like NephSci. As a feldspar, you'll often find this thing that says it's a more powerful feldspar, or people will refer to it as that, and that is not true either literally or philosophically. It's just a feldspar, feldspathoid, that has less silica and alumina in it. That does not inherently make it more powerful, okay? And that's a very important distinction. It does mean that it melts at a lower temperature, because remember that the whole path of melting is that the fluxes begin to activate, and then that melts the silica and alumina in the system. If there is less silica and alumina, it melts faster, and since the kiln is constantly climbing, that means it does it at an inherently lower temperature. And maybe you think that this is a semantic difference, but I think it's an important difference about how we look at that material, because we started to talk about frits, and frits often get this distinction of, oh, well, frits melt at this temperature, this is the temperature of that frit. And actually I want to dissociate you from that notion as well, because frits work just fine at all temperatures. Okay, it's how you use them and how you take advantage of the chemistry. If you're just throwing it in there, into a glaze formula randomly, yeah, of course it's going to change the inherent performance of the chemistry, or the inherent performance of the glaze. But if you're looking at the chemistry, you can make these things happen at any temperature. Some of my favorite glaze formulas have frits at cone 10, which a lot of people would tell you not to do, because they'll say, oh, that's too far beyond the melting temperature. But as we start going about what's going on with the molecules in our glaze as melting happens, as the rest of the course continues, we'll start to discover that, no, we have a lot more flexibility with these sorts of concepts, that there are not certain materials that are dictated to certain temperatures, with certain exceptions that we don't really get into until glazes 2. And that primarily is just that feldspars are generally not used in cone 04 glazes, because you're just so far beneath the melting temperature. And beneath the melting temperature is a problem. If your feldspar doesn't melt until cone 2, and you're firing to cone 04, that's not going to melt, and that becomes a problem. But if you're going over the inherent melting temperature of that material, it doesn't matter. You can still fire it to a much hotter temperature and without any problems. Sometimes you'll hear some discussion about, oh, well, this material breaks down and that causes bubbles, and that's a load of malarkey that we can talk about later. I know that last night came up in this week's lectures, and I do want to talk about some things that actually I did leave out in the last night lectures, or in the last night section, as we go on tonight. But I'm rambling. Do you all have any questions at this point?
Not right now.
No? Okay.
Let's see. So from lecture 4, you said that you have to add water to get kaolin to be like kaolin. Something about charges. Can you explain that?
So kaolin, we always think of clay as you go down to the riverbed and there's this sticky stuff that we can, extract, and then we dry it and, we can turn it into clay. Kaolin in and of itself is really just a rock. When you're looking at it, it's very hard to distinguish from many rocks. It's a softer rock. Like if you've ever seen sandstone, like you can pick up sandstone in a lake bed and just crush it with your fingers. Kaolin is like that, but it's just a rock. It's not that sort of sticky material, but that the stickiness really is activated when you take the dry powder and you mix it with water. If you just go into the glaze lab and you get a handful of EPK and you smush it, it's not going to stick together because you need the water to activate the electromagnetic charge of the clay particle. So that's really all that I'm saying with that. That you can force it together as the raw material, but the rock itself, it is a rock. So if you go down to like the EPK mine, it looks like a rock mine, and it's not until they crush it and sieve it, and then we reprocess it into plastic clay that it behaves the way we know it as clay.
Okay. About packing efficiency. So you want stuff to be sort of efficient, but you said you wouldn't want it to be 100%. Is there like an optimal level that you're looking for, or number? Or?
Yep, that's a very big subject, and we talk about that a lot in the clays class. Ultimately, with packing efficiency, you want to be roughly 60 to 70%. Okay. Number one, you don't want it to be 100% because there would be no space for water. Okay, and water is very, very important in our clay bodies. But when it comes down to refining our individual materials to pack very efficiently in a clay, you want it to be somewhere between 60 and 70% packing efficiency.
Okay. Did you post the worksheet about SSA and dispersants? Sorry if my notes don't make sense.
No, let me see if it's on here. Just questions, assignments, course documents. Book list of periodic table, stall map, glaze map, chemical analysis, phase diagram, mesh sizes. Yeah, stick-up slip. The one labeled stick-up slip will have the dispersion curve in it.
All right. I have some kind of like random questions probably to ask at another time.
You can ask them.
Oh, well. Okay, I'll try to make it quick though. So the work that I do is, I don't know, I don't glaze anything. I burnish stuff and then like really low fire it. I bisque to 010, and that is because, and I haven't like tested this out, but it seems not to ruin the quality of the burnishing. And then I barrel fire things, and it's working well. Things haven't broken amazingly, and I get like a real nice gloss and everything. But I use a Cone 6 clay body, standard 240, which I have no idea like what's in that because I don't know anything. And I'm starting to wonder like, oh, should I be using a low temperature body or something else? Like, what is the best way to make my work more durable? Or should I just give up on this because it's working well enough for now?
I would probably say at this point, if it's working well enough for now and you're not concerned with function, I would just go with it.
Yeah.
As with any commercial clay body, I can't tell you what's in it either. No one releases their formulas. So if it works for you, that's fine. I'm always wary of commercial clay bodies. A lot of commercial clays have big mixing issues. A lot of them compositionally aren't great. But if you're not, say, getting a lot of cracking, especially after the firing, then you're probably okay. I might be concerned with thermal shock in the body from undissolved quartz since you're firing so low. So quartz, silica, flint has very high thermal expansion. So every time you heat it, it expands a great deal. Whereas glass and glazes, if you were using glazes, have a relatively low thermal expansion. We sort of solve this problem because when we fire to cone 10, we dissolve most of the quartz, which then becomes glass, and the glass has low thermal expansion. It's sort of a weird thing where native quartz is very high thermal expansion, but as soon as you turn it into glass, the thermal expansion goes way, way down. One of the big problems we have in all ceramics is that clay and glazes have different thermal expansions because the glaze is essentially all glass, and the clay often will have some remaining quartz. Now, if you're taking a body that's designed to go to cone 6 and you're only firing it to O10, there's a lot of undissolved quartz in there. But you also don't have glaze. Great, so you don't have to worry about the mismatch. And B, it's homogeneous. Okay, so you've got the same amount of undissolved quartz everywhere in that body. So it's expanding evenly. You know, one of the biggest problems that we have in firing ceramics is things moving and shifting unevenly. Okay, that's why I often talk about how, like, I fire super fast, like I am ruthless about how I fire. Well, I'm firing test tiles or small pots, so you know my things are very, very even, and they can take the heat changes very quickly. Now, if you make large scale, you know, life-size buffalo, you do have to fire those slowly because ceramics are an insulator, meaning they resist heat, and so it takes time for the heat to normalize inside that wear. So, you know, your thickest part of the foot is going to take a lot more time for the heat to penetrate through there, so you fire it much more slowly. But for you, you know, if it works, it's fine. You know, if if it's just burnished work that's essentially sculptural, that's great. I will fully admit that actually I've put very little thought into the scientific process behind burnishing.
I'm really curious about that, and I don't know anything about it.
I will be blunt. Let's see. It's 2016. I haven't burnished anything since 1994. So, and I've never really put much thought into it. I mean, you're compressing the outer layer of clay particles. There's always certainly that talk that it burns out, you know, that you lose the burnish when you go to higher temperatures. As with anything, my first response is skepticism, and the only thing I can reference it to is Terra Sigillata. Terra Sig will come up later. But my favorite resource on Terra Sig is this book, The Ceramic Process by Anton Rengers, who's a Dutch artist, and he taught me about Terra Sig when he was in Alfred, and really he makes Terra Sigs that are very, very robust, that don't need burnishing at all and don't lose their sheen at all, and it comes purely through processing the materials differently than we have historically made Terra Sig. He really, briefly, he just beats the hell out of his mix, and I don't know if you've made Terra Sig before, but you know, you basically take clay, just raw clay, and you mix it with water, and you mix and mix and mix it so that none of the particles stick together. Okay, you add a little bit of dispersant to make sure that they're all broken apart, and then the heavy particles sink and the light particles float, and then the middle, the water sits on top. So you've got your 3 levels, and you extract that middle layer of light clay particles. Really, what Anton talks about is to mix it twice. With a really high intensity mixer, like a super fast Char type mixer, or I guess more commonly like an immersion blender or a blender, to really make sure that those particles that you have are absolutely separated, opposed to I should say that the other part historically that things were made is people would say to ball mill it. And in a ball mill, you've got, you know, a porcelain jar full of tiny little hard balls made of more porcelain, and you tumble it. And what happens is that those balls, they smash together as the jar tumbles, and that smashing actually takes big particles and makes them smaller. Anton's theory is you don't want to do that because you're just taking the big crappy particles that you never wanted in the first place and making it and putting it into your fine Terra Sig. Whereas he says if you just mix it and make sure all the particles get separated, you'll get the best particles just off the top. And ball milling is detrimental to that. So where I'm going is that I would guess that burnishing would be somewhere along those lines, but since you don't have any control over your clay formula, I don't know if that's an option. Or I should say it is inherently not an option because you're not picking a clay for optimal burnishing or designing a clay for optimal burnishing.
Yeah, I have limited resources.
Right.
All I know is I've tried to do it with the Cone 6 porcelain, like kind of porcelain that has growlig in it, and could not burnish up the same way, which I thought was interesting but did not have an explanation for.
It's a particle packing issue. But again, it is something that I should put on my list to study down the road of how well different compositions burnish based on different ways we categorize clay bodies. Again, with the commercial, I can't say, even saying, I deal with lots of people who give me lots of numbers and names of clay bodies, and I just shrug my shoulders because even if I knew that clay, like from working with it, I don't know what's in it. But if it works, go with it. Which is sometimes the answer.
Yeah, well, so far, but I'm just trying to be pragmatic.
Try different clays. I mean, if your clay supplier will give you samples, try a little thing of everything they've got. Some clay suppliers will, give you a pound or two just to try.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, when you show firing curves, what units are like absorption? I'm just curious, like, what are you thinking? Is it like a percentage? Or?
Yeah, it's percent absorption.
Okay. When you were talking about your favorite Cone 6 glossy glaze, you said 75% frit. Which frit?
3124.
Okay. And 25% clay, was that EPK? And maybe that's it for now. Oh, okay. I do have one more question.
Okay.
So you said, okay. So regarding putting feldspars of different types in bodies, potassium's good, sodium's bad. Potassium, you said, does not deflocculate the body.
Right.
Does that mean it does not make it rubbery because it doesn't do that charge change thing?
Correct.
Okay. And also, I am just sometimes confused about the word deflocculate. And does that mean, actually, I don't know. Do you want to go into that?
Sure. Deflocculation is literally making the particles repel each other. And, the common way that most people talk about is literally a flock of sheep. If you deflocculate them, they disperse all over the place. And if you flocculate your sheep, you're sticking them all together. So a deflocculant, which generally comes in this brand name of Darvan, but there's lots of other, basically any sodium source will act as a deflocculant, which just makes the particles spread apart. Historically, what deflocculants are really used for, again, is in casting slips. And that's really important because if you're a slip caster, now, do either of you have experience slip casting?
I just know what it is.
Yeah. Okay, so when you're slip casting, you're pouring liquid clay into a plaster mold. The plaster absorbs the water and has the negative shape of your object. So you pour in the liquid slip, you let it sit, and the plaster sucks the water out of the slip and leaves a thin... Do I have a slip? Well, these are slip casts, but this isn't. It gives you a very defined shape. What do I have that's better than slip cast right here? Actually, most of the stuff people deal with every day is slipcast. Anyway, so it gives you a very, a detailed object. It's whatever the shape of the mold is. But the fact is that plaster is absorbing the water. And that has a couple of problems. One, it limits how many casts you can do in a day. Usually you slipcast for two reasons. One, you want multiples. Okay. Two, you want a shape that is not made on the wheel or made by hand building. So I like in my studio I slipcast because I spend days and weeks and months making a model out of generally plasticine, which is oil-based clay that doesn't dry. I want to spend weeks working on that single object, so I've got lots of that would be a problem if I had to work with wet clay because the clay is always drying. It's sort of a bizarre conceptual thing that clay is actually a time-based medium in every form except slip casting. So anyway, so if you want that crazy shape or you want multiples, well, if you want multiples, you want to cast as many times in a workday as you can. And if the plaster is constantly absorbing water, it's slowly becoming saturated. So what you want to do to get more casts in a day is to minimize the amount of water the plaster absorbs per cast. Okay, and we use deflocculants to do that, because what the deflocculants do is, again, that they take our clay particles, which have a positive and a negative side that are sticking together, and it turns basically all the negatives positive. So you've got then two positive sides, and those two sides repel each other. Okay, and what this means is that the clay now never sticks together. That way, we were just talking about at the beginning of the hangout that clay is sticking together. With the deflocculants, they never stick together. Okay, until you force them together. But in the liquid, they never do, and so that way they flow better without water, because there's always a space for water in between every particle. So it actually requires less water. And that gives us more casts per day. So you can get 6 casts per day, or you can get 8 casts per day instead of 6. Which again, if you're casting multiples, is important. And then that also translates into the more water you put into a plaster mold, the faster the mold dies, because plaster molds are constantly degrading and falling apart. So deflocculants help to that end.
I'm used to hearing about deflocculants and flocculants, or flocculation or whatever, with glazes. Are we going to go into that more in the future?
We don't particularly go into it because the stick-up slip discussion will go in or show you some of the examples. They're used in glazes, and in fact, one of my Glazes 2 students right now is doing this big study on pinholing, where she's deflocculating glazes to see how it affects pinholing. Usually the answer is, if you've got a glaze that's very, very thick, it's generally because it's got a lot of clay in it. As we've discussed, from a formula standpoint, you generally want to see 10% clay in a glaze formula. But you will definitely see glazes that have 15, 20, 25, 30% clay. You don't see a lot that have more than that, with the one exception being Shino-type glazes or Krull-type glazes, which both have high clay content. Which causes their particular effect. We will talk about how dispersants affect those when we get into special effect glazes somewhere in the second to last week. But yeah, if you want to change the way that a glaze flows and packs, you can add dispersants. Oftentimes, on the other end, we do have flocculants, which are the opposite of deflocculants, and that generally comes in the form of Epsom salts, is what most people will use. But calcium chloride also works, which is ice melter, that you put down on the sidewalk. But Epsom salts, generally the same stuff you get at the pharmacy and soak your feet in. That will actually make clay particles come closer together or flocculate. Getting into the chemistry and physics of all that's a little bit complicated, but understand that it'll make glazes thicken.
So that's like if your glaze is hard panning?
Well, yeah, some people will use Epsom salts to keep glazes from hard panning. It's not my preferred method to stop hard panning. I think a lot of glazes that do hard pan can be fixed with changing the chemistry and bringing in a little bit more clay, or using bentonite. But the hard panning, hard panning is one of those funny things. Actually, it's sort of talking about sodium as a dispersant. I have found a lot of times glazes that have sodium feldspar in them will hard pan, and it's because the sodium is acting like a dispersant even in the glaze, which makes the clay particles ineffective and the glaze material sink to the bottom and hard pan. Sylvia, do you know what hard panning is?
I'm not really sure. No.
Hard panning is when all the materials sink to the bottom of a bucket. So if you ever come across a glaze bucket and everything's down at the bottom and you got to get in there with a stick and gouge it out and dig it and remix it, that's hard panning.
So can hard panning be solved by just mixing it really well, or is that a little different?
Nope. You're going to have to either increase your clay content, which is why I talk about you really want a formula to have at least 10% clay content, because the clay in a glaze is there for 2 reasons. One, it keeps all your materials suspended and keeps them from hard panning. 2, is that it provides alumina in a fairly accessible chemical form, because clay is Al2O3 SiO2 2H2O. So some formulas, and this is what we start on Friday when we start to talk about the subtlety of what's really going on in glaze formula. Some formulas you can't add more clay because you want a particular effect, and we'll talk about how that works starting on Friday. You can use Epsom salts to do it. It's not the best method, but you can. Yeah.
Okay. One last thing I'd like to learn about, which
Sure.
may come up later, is I'd like to find a way to draw on pots, period. And I'd like to know, like, the best way to do this.
I mean, what do you want to draw?
Oh, kind of like design draw-y things. You know how they make these like glaze pencils or glaze pastels or things like that now. Just like the most effective way to make like a nice dark line that you could make with like a thin little brush that wouldn't run, that kind of thing. I don't know if we're gonna like talk about stuff like that.
You know what works really well for that is, do you know those little glaze pencils that draw? No,
Okay.
I mean, I don't mean to be sarcastic, but those actually work really well. And I only say that because historically, with my on-campus class, everybody gets to do a research project. And every year somebody comes and says, hey, I want to make my own glaze pencils. And my response is always, yeah, there are three things I don't allow students to make. One is glaze pencils, two is stains, three is frits, because it takes a massive amount of work that gets you very little result, and the commercial products work very well. Is that something we talk about? No, not particularly. If you just want to draw, I mean, yeah, underglaze pencils work amazingly well. If you want to paint, you certainly can make various iron oxide washes or washes with other oxides. It just depends on how you want to paint with them, but they're definitely a liquid process. It doesn't have a pencil-like option. For a dry, literal drawing effect, unfortunately, I mean, underglazed pencils are really the way to go.
For the oxide washes, are we going to get into that? I know that those are pretty simple, though, right?
We don't really get into them because they are super simple. You literally just mix the oxide and water. Sometimes you'll add a little bit of clay to keep it suspended, and that's it. I mean, it's really nothing special. The big one is iron.
Yeah, I've used that before.
Yeah, it depends on the color. It depends on your firing. You certainly can do. There are some washes out there that are made to react. Like I used to always make one in undergrad that was a half black copper oxide, half Frit 3110 wash. But that burnt. It wasn't for detail. It was more for rubbing in crevices and sort of making shadows sort of appear in recesses in a pot. But yeah, I mean, you can do iron washes. Manganese washes are popular. It's not particularly, like I said, it's pretty much just the oxide plus a little bit of clay to keep it suspended, and maybe, depending on how well you want it to melt in, is frit. The catch with a lot of them, and why, again, the underglaze pencils work really well, is that if you do glaze over them, they will tend to melt into the glaze, if not thoroughly absorbed into the body. And so it's really hard to keep that crisp line, and you'll find a lot of artists really do that. This also leads to a greater discussion, which does come up later, which is the talk about different decorative styles. And you get a lot of people that sort of are looking for a particular effect, and what it comes down to is that most effects are limited by process. The best painterly technique you can get is China paints, which are amazing and beautiful. So somebody like Kurt Weiser, who does these amazing China painting things, but the China painting process is very specific, and a lot of people will turn their nose up to it. Because of the whole grandma association. But China painting is amazing. It's very labor intensive, because what most people don't realize about China painting is that it's you put down you put down a layer of China paint, like a very thin, what they would call an oil painting, a glaze, and then you fire it overnight, just to set that in. You don't do the entire painting at once. You do small sections building color and depth and texture. So yeah, but it's low fire. It's not food safe. It's a lot of process. But for straight up drawing, yeah, I mean sort of underglaze pencils.
Okay, there's a lot to consider. I haven't done any drawing, so I want to give it a try.
You know, there are a lot of people that like Myolica. There's a lot of people that like painting with underglaze slips. Underglaze slips are, again, one of those things of if you really want to get into painting decorative slips, again, I just say go commercial, because the palette of colors you want versus how much processing you'd have to do to get something consistent. Unfortunately, no matter how much I do want to advocate people doing their own thing, you know, underglaze painting, probably, you know, you get the little couple ounce jars of underglaze, and then you can have 100 colors, you know. So that sort of works a lot better. Myolica, you can make your own, but that's all overglaze. So it really depends on what you're looking for.
Okay. All right, that's it for me. I think, yeah.
You can keep asking. I mean, I was just going to rant about last night here for a minute.
No, go for it. If I find something else, I'll jump in.
Well, the main thing I wanted to say that's missing from the lecture is coming back to why do people use wollastonite in glazes? It's a calcium source, which is fine, but it's you know, one calcium molecule and one silica molecule, and we always have to ask this question as we get deeper into our formulas, and starting to become evident now that we're always dealing with silica. Okay, every material we have except one has silica in it. Okay, our feldspars have silica. Our clays have silica. Our silica has silica in it. The only material that we introduce in our glazes, aside from colorants, that doesn't have silica in it is our alkaline earths. Now, there are certain exceptions that we do use a form of silica, and that comes into the talc issue, which came up in yesterday's class. And that talc we use because magnesium carbonate is so light and fluffy, it's just hard to incorporate into the glaze mix. So we tend to use talc, although the current paranoia about lawsuits is making talc less popular. It's fine. I mean, I talk about it's how it doesn't work in low temperature clay bodies, but that's a whole other topic. So we come back to this question of wollastonite, which is, again, calcium and silica, and sort of go, why would we be using this material in our glazes? And when I first put the course together, I sort of didn't have an answer to that, and then I finally came to realize something. And it comes down to an issue that's not really about wollastonite. It's about pinholing. There is this belief, and I sort of hate to do this because you guys are relatively untainted, and I may teach you something that is complete hokum in the effect of teaching you the opposite, but there is this belief that pinholing is often caused by gases being released during firing, specifically from calcium carbonate, but also strontium carbonate are considered the two major offenders, not barium for a minute, for a reason I'll talk about in a second. And so people say that, oh, well, if whiting is calcium carbonate, which could also be written as CaO, CO2, that CO2 is carbon dioxide, which is just a common everyday gas. And that it definitely is composed of carbon dioxide. It's calcium oxide and carbon dioxide. That's why it's the carbonate. And that carbon dioxide does not hang around in the glaze. It definitely gets driven off in the glaze. And a lot of people think that it gets driven off at a point when the glaze is melting and it causes pinholes. And we will talk about, I'm not going to actually go into the pinhole aspect of it at this point. That comes up much later in the course. But I do want to talk about this notion that the whiting or the strontium carb are driving off gases during the firing. They absolutely are. The problem is that they are not driving off gases during the melting portion of the firing. Okay, our glazes don't melt until the last 100 to 150 degrees C of the firing. So if we're firing to cone 10, our glazes don't really start to melt until somewhere between cone 2 and cone 4. The thing is that the carbon in calcium carbonate is very well documented to come out around, I believe it's around 830 C. So 300 degrees C before then. Okay, long before anything is melting in our glaze, which means it's all this open pockets of air and material. Okay, and it just goes away. It goes through the open network of pores in the glaze application, and it disappears. It goes into the kiln and goes up the chimney. Strontium does disassociate at a slightly higher temperature. It dissociates at about 930 C. Okay, still much, much farther below the dissociation temperature that people would say is happening in a glaze. Now, if you got the thought with the pinholes is that the gas is released from the degradation of the calcium carbonate, and you've got this melting glaze, and that gas forms a bubble, and the bubble swells and pops. Again, if it was happening at those temperatures, it might well be the case, but the fact is that it's happening long, long before then. So why does this have anything to do with wollastonite? Well, people will use wollastonite under the assumption that because it's not a carbonate, it's calcium oxide and silica, that there's no carbon dioxide that comes off. So it doesn't release any gas bubbles and theoretically minimizes pinholing. This is actually hokum. And again, I'm not going to get into the subtlety of why, because we spend a whole lecture, well, half a lecture talking about pinholes and where they come from and how they come from. But that the short version is that wollastonite doesn't have any of those effects, and it really only brings in more silica in the one source where we don't have silica, which becomes a problem when we get into the compositions, because when our glazes melt, as we're getting into in the next several classes, everything melts into the glaze soup. Okay, so silica that comes from the feldspar, and the silica that comes in from the clay, and the silica that comes in from the quartz is all the same silica. The glaze doesn't care where it comes from. It just cares that it's silica. So to bring in another source that's bringing in even more silica that's tied to our fluxes becomes a problem as we proceed. So, you know, using wollastonite in glazes, I've never once made a glaze from a formula where it needed wollastonite or where I put wollastonite in. It's sort of a ridiculous glaze material. And we'll get into the reasons why you absolutely don't. But I just wanted to add that caveat of sort of, since I recorded this class originally, of really thinking about why people are doing it and talking to some other people about why they put wollastonite in. They generally claim that it's this pinholing issue, but that's not going to solve pinholing. Or if it does, it's not. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to say about that. It's crazy person rant for the evening. But I just did want to address that. Do you guys have any other questions?
If it was in one of the readings or lectures, I forget now, is there one specific thing that causes pinholing?
Yes. But are you asking, is it the same thing every time that causes pinholing? Like...
yeah, I mean, I would think it might be a couple factors, but I'm not sure.
Well, the common answer is what I was just talking about. People will say that it is bubbles evolving in the glaze melt. That, I am 98% sure, is complete bull. Okay? And as that'll come up in this glaze lecture. I am also 70% sure that it is actually an application problem. And that's what Sue in my Glazes 2 class is studying right now, is she's looking at that as the condition to see if it really is an application issue. The thing about the bubbles forming again, we'll get into why that's not the case, but it basically defies the laws of physics for it to be bubble formation. But again, that literally we'll spend half a lecture talking about it down the line, so don't want to give away it all right now, or I'll kill my big finish. Yeah, but I mean, in ceramics, you can never say that anything is ever always the cause, but glaze application is, if I had to pick one major cause, I'd say application. Any other questions? Oh, good. I answered everything. So, a few housekeeping things. Oh, you're making a face, Kristen.
Oh, I don't know. Okay, one last thing.
I don't care. I got nowhere to be.
You said in Lecture 6, some talcs contain carbonates, can lead to bloating. Maybe that was just on a slide.
Yeah, it's more of a problem of the so we had this wonderful talc called Nitalc, and it went away and was replaced by another talc, which I won't name the name brand, but it's this gray talc that everybody has right now. The problem is that it's dirty as hell. It's just got a lot of things in it, and it's been reported again that there is off-gassing in it that's causing bloating. I don't have any proof of it. I haven't seen it. I have seen plenty of problems from this other form of talc. It's very hard to incorporate into water. This is one of those things. If I had somebody send me a picture and I cannot find it, and I went digging for it, and I even emailed them, and they didn't have it anymore. But I was literally sent a picture by a friend where her friend, who was a slip caster, so she had casting slip, and had this vase where you could literally see streaks swirling around the slip cast vase because the talc was so poorly incorporated into her clay body. So it just has a lot of problems. Again, I haven't seen the bloating per se, but it's been reported. This talc is a problem, but Nitalc is never coming back. So until somebody finds a new source, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. I'm really done with my questions now.
Okay. What was I going to say? Okay. So, yep, the midterm is up. It's all multiple choice, so, it should be pretty straightforward. I think it's up until Friday. I can tell you that right now. Let me just look at it. It's up until Friday night at 11:30. So you have time to do it. Don't stress out about it. All multiple choice. The one thing I also wanted to shoot, there's something else and it just flew across my mind. I do want to plant in your mind. So next week we will have a normal hangout. We do have to start to consider that. So next week is week 4. Weeks 5 and 6 is when I am on the road. And if you guys have any flexibility in time as to other meetings, because this time with me on the road will be 2 a.m. I'll do it. I'm dedicated to making sure you guys have that. But I started a discussion in the message board about what other times might work for you. The first thought that comes to my mind is not. Well, you're both on the East Coast, because Sylvia, you're in Connecticut. So, because my other classes, I have people on the West Coast too. And in this, I think in this class, May is the only person, and she's in Japan, and she's obviously not showing up to these anyway. So Europe is 6 hours ahead. So my only thought would result in a late night for you guys. Like I could do like later in the morning, like 4 or 5 a.m. Theoretically get more sleep. But if you just want to stick with the 2 a.m., we can stick with the 2 a.m. My other complication is the last week might be complicated just because I am traveling on that evening, but I should be fine. So anyway, if you guys are flexible as to other possible times, like early mornings or a lunchtime meeting for you guys, like lunchtime would actually be best because that would be like 6 p.m. where I am, and then noon for you guys. So anyway, just to think, and I'm flexible sort of as to days, so just something to brainstorm on. We have 2 weeks until this actually becomes something that we have to deal with anyway.
I'm totally flexible.
Totally.
Totally not working. Awesome.
Sylvia, what's your schedule look like?
Mine should be fine too. I only ever have to work like Wednesday or Thursday if there's some kind of schedule change, but for now, I don't think I'll have to.
Okay, well, if we could aim for a noon or a 1 p.m. Eastern time, that would be amazing for me. But we'll figure it out when we're a little bit closer to that. So the last thing I wanted to say is, so we've now gotten through materials, right? And the lecture that comes out on Friday is going to melt your brains. Okay, this is when things actually get like serious, and you're going to be like, whoa, and then you're going to be like, whoa, and then you're going to be like, oh my god. Like lecture 7 is my favorite lecture in this course because it just like things go crazy. And it's a ton of fun. Like I know, like this part's like all this leading up to now. Not that it hasn't been great, but it's a little bit dry and droll. And it's like, hey, where are the glazes? Where are the glazes? So we really start to talk about glaze composition. We start to talk about firing and temperature. What the fluxes are really doing, what the glass formers are really doing, what's the deal with matte glazes. Like all of this becomes a reality starting on Friday's lecture. So it's a big fun one. You may want to watch it more than once, just because it's it starts to get a lot of information thrown at you. The math and the chemistry start to get really intense at this point. If you're not sort of following, you may want to jump back, review some of these concepts about what moles are, or how the atoms and molecules are working, because it'll get intense, and since it's three lectures a week, like here on out, like let's see, looking at my class, looking at the schedule, because we do that. Then we start to get into how temperature works, meaning cone 6, cone 04, special effects, glaze, flaws, and color. So it just goes like crazy from here for the rest of the class. So it might get a little intense, but take your time. And like I said, that's what I love about the online format, since you can jump back and go through it again and digest it again. Use the message board if you've got questions. I'm easy to get a hold of. Okay?
One more thing. The term paper.
Yes.
Oh,
has that gone public yet?
There's been some info about it.
The writing assignment is live, so you'll find a description of the writing assignment in the course documents.
Right. Should we claim materials?
Yeah, I mean, there's only 5 of you in this class, so it's not that, it's usually not clamoring for fighting for particularly anything. But actually, why don't you start a thread on the message board if you want to claim something, and that'll just be the official claim it so everybody can see it area.
Okay. And how do you art people do research writing?
I'm pretty casual. I don't expect a scientific dissertation. I just want you to document what the subject is at hand in a clear, concise manner. Use the references that are out there. A lot of people tend to quote me from the class because I contradict what you'll find in literature. I'm not crazy about that, but I get why people do it. And I still haven't written my book. But I hesitate to put a lot of strict rules on it because a lot of my art students are not great at writing. No offense to everybody. I'm more than happy if you're just sort of can take a subject, pull up as much background as you can, be as thorough about it as you can, and make complete sentences. But I'm not even that picky on that.
Excellent. Yeah, I have like half of the books on your list sitting
good.
around here, so
Yeah.
hopefully that will help.
If you get a copy of, say, Rhodes and the Potter's Dictionary, uh, you're basically got what you need.
Yeah, I got those.
Yeah.
All right. Good.
Okay. Cool
Okay.
beans. Alrighty, folks. So we will be back next Wednesday. I will still be in country. So enjoy. Like these, I love these next three. Like the lectures you get this week, I wish I could go back and learn them again because these are like, this is what you came for. This'll change your world. Yeah. We'll talk about the other effects on it after at next week's meeting.
I was actually wondering about one more thing.
Mm-hmm.
It should be quick. You were saying before how your mother-in-law would get I think it was her clay
Yep.
from by the river.
Yep.
Do you know how she or anyone would find out that it's clay and not just regular like mud or dirt?
Well, it's pretty much that it holds its shape. That's the basic thing. If it's just mud, sort of the test I do is that if you take it and you hold it in your hand, and you do that sort of make a slug that's the negative space of your hand, and you let go and you sort of shake it. You just shake your hand. If it's just mud, it'll actually just lose its shape and just sort of splay out. But most clays will continue to hold that shape. And a lot of as long as it's not silty, a lot of clay beds will have it. So if it'll hold its shape, throw it into a kiln and see if it holds its shape again. With that process, it's not necessarily pure clay. There's a lot of other stuff that'll be in there, but you can also look. Your local geologic survey office will often have records as to where clay deposits are known. So, or you can just go down to your riverbed and grab dig out some clay, dig out some of the bank and take it back to the studio and fire it and see what survives. Just make sure to take thorough notes.
I know someone who did something like that. She went to a beach in a different, I don't know if it was, I think it was a different country, like an island or something.
Mm-hmm.
And she noticed that some of the people there were like playing with clay, and she asked where they got it from, and it was from like some kind of like mountain or something nearby. So she went there and she took some back with her and fired it and did like tests at different cones to see what it looked like. That was interesting.
Yeah, they're totally usable clays. I don't have one of my mother-in-law's pots within reach, but she always had a nice terracotta. She never added anything to it. She would dry it and smash it with a hammer and then run it through a window screen to get any large chunks of rocks or branches or anything else that might be in it. And then she just reconstituted. She didn't add any feldspar or any fluxes at all. And it worked as a terracotta. It's not a vitrified clay by any sense, but she was doing recreation colonial slipware. Which I can see from here. I don't see any pots in there. But yeah, they work really, really well if you're working at low temperature. Cool. So, anything else? Nope. Head shakes all around. Alrighty, folks. Well, I will see you next week. Enjoy the exam. Like I said, it's all multiple choice, so it shouldn't hurt too much.
Can you start it and then go away and then come back to it?
I think so, but I've never taken it, so yes, you've got to be able to. It's all just in Blackboard, so it's literally like a question pops up and you answer it, and the next question pops up and you answer it. So, yeah, I think you should be able to close it and go back. These are always, unfortunately, there are problems with Blackboard. Like, I see a completely different Blackboard than you guys do as the professor, so I never quite know how things how exactly they work. But
okay.
If for some reason you leave and you can't get back in, let me know, and I'm pretty sure I can reset it for you.
Okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty, folks.
Thank you.
See everybody next week.
Bye.
Bye.